There's a woman, researchers call her SM, who was once approached at night in a park by a man with a knife pressed to her throat. She looked at him and said, "If you're going to kill me, you're going to have to go through my God." Then she walked away. She was never afraid. Not once. Not of the knife. Not of the man. Not even for a second afterward. Now here's where it gets strange. SM isn't brave in the way we normally mean. She's not trained. She's not a soldier. She's not fearless because she's overcome fear. Her brain is missing the structure that generates fear, and scientists at the University of Iowa have been studying her since the 1980s, trying to understand what that actually means. Because here's what they found. A life without fear isn't the superpower you might think it is. It's something far more complicated and far more revealing about why fear exists in the first place. To understand SM, you have to understand a small almond-shaped structure buried deep inside your temporal lobe called the amygdala. You actually have two of them, one in each hemisphere. And while the amygdala is involved in many things, social bonding, memory consolidation, certain kinds of emotional learning, its most famous job is fear. When you see a snake, hear a sudden noise, or sense that someone is following you, the amygdala fires fast. Before your conscious mind has fully processed what's happening, it has already begun coordinating a stress response. Your heart accelerates, your muscles tense, your pupils dilate, you're ready to run, fight, or freeze, all before you've thought a single coherent thought. This response is ancient. It predates humans by hundreds of millions of years. It's been conserved across evolution because it works. SM doesn't have it. She has a condition called Urbach-Wiethe disease, an extraordinarily rare genetic disorder caused by mutations in the ECM1 gene on chromosome 1, with only a few hundred documented cases worldwide. In SM's case, it caused progressive calcification of her amygdalae, destroying them almost completely. Researchers who have studied her describe her as having one of the most complete bilateral amygdala lesions ever documented in the scientific literature. And the results of living without them are not what most people would guess. Yes, she cannot feel fear. She's been tested in laboratory conditions, handling snakes and tarantulas, walking through a haunted attraction at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, watching fear-inducing clips from The Shining and The Silence of the Lambs. Nothing. No flinch, no spike in heart rate, no fear. But she's also been mugged, held at knife point, threatened on multiple occasions. She has reportedly wandered into dangerous situations without the internal alarm bell that would stop most people. Without the signal your brain generates, "Stop, don't go there, something is wrong." She has no early warning system. Here's what the researchers concluded. SM doesn't lack courage, she lacks information. Fear, it turns out, is data. Most of us spend enormous energy trying to reduce fear. We avoid it, suppress it, medicate it. Anxiety disorders are among the most common mental health conditions on the planet, affecting an estimated 284 million people worldwide, according to global burden of disease estimates. The pharmaceutical market for anti-anxiety treatment runs into the tens of billions of dollars annually. We treat fear like a malfunction. But SM's case, and the research that followed from it, began reshaping how neuroscientists understand fear's actual purpose. Because fear doesn't just respond to danger, it predicts it. It runs a continuous probability calculation about your environment, your history, your physical state, and it updates constantly. Then came an experiment that nobody expected. In 2013, Justin Feinstein and colleagues published a study in Nature Neuroscience testing what would happen if SM and two other patients with similar amygdala damage from the same disease were given carbon dioxide to inhale, a concentration of CO2 that the body interprets as a signal of suffocation. The researchers expected that because the amygdala was absent, the patients would be unaffected. They were completely wrong. All three patients panicked. More severely, in fact, than many of the neurologically intact control participants who didn't panic at all. Which meant the amygdala is not the only fear circuit in the human brain. There are deeper, more primitive pathways. Researchers point to brainstem regions like the parabrachial nucleus, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, and related structures that appear to operate independently of the amygdala when the threat comes from inside the body rather than from the environment. The amygdala is the one you learn fear through. The other circuits respond to direct biological crisis, when your body itself is the alarm. This finding revealed a distinction that changed the field. There is learned fear and there is survival panic. They can feel similar from the inside. They use different hardware, and that matters more than almost anyone realized, because it begins to explain why some people can suppress conditioned fear, why certain trauma responses are so resistant to treatment, and why SM, despite having no functional amygdala, could still experience something unmistakably like terror. Let's stay with the amygdala for a moment, because the problem isn't just when it goes missing. The problem is also when it gets stuck. In most people, the amygdala operates as part of a network. It receives input, it fires, and then, critically, the medial prefrontal cortex, the region involved in rational evaluation and emotional regulation, reaches back and dampens the response. Okay, that was a false alarm. Stand down. That feedback loop is everything. It's what allows you to be startled by a car backfiring and then laugh it off 30 seconds later. It's what allows someone to return from a genuinely dangerous situation and eventually feel safe again. In people with PTSD, that loop is disrupted. A substantial body of neuroimaging research, much of it built on work by Lisa Shin and colleagues, published across multiple studies through the 2000s, found that PTSD is associated with hyperactivation of the amygdala combined with hypoactivation of the medial prefrontal cortex. The threat signal fires, and the regulatory circuit that normally dampens it is underperforming. Based on what we can observe in the imaging data, it's as though the shutoff switch exists, but can no longer reliably come on. This is why trauma feels so present. It's not purely a memory problem, it's an inability to signal safety. The amygdala has encoded that something was dangerous, and without sufficient prefrontal override, it keeps treating the lesson as current every time something in the environment faintly resembles the original threat. Now here's where the science forced a rethink. Researchers once assumed the solution was to weaken the fear memory, to erase or dampen it. But you can't delete a learned association from a living brain the way you delete a file. What you can do is form a competing memory, one that says, this stimulus is no longer dangerous. This process is called fear extinction. It's the neurological foundation of exposure therapy, one of the best supported treatments for PTSD and anxiety disorders that exists. The goal isn't to eliminate fear. It's to build a new pathway that wins the argument, one where the prefrontal cortex learns to speak up, and the amygdala, over time, learns to listen. Back to SM, because her story doesn't end with the knife in the park. Researchers working with her have documented something that goes beyond the obvious absence of fear. She also has difficulty reading fear in others' faces, and shows impaired declarative memory for emotionally arousing events, a function that, in healthy brains, is enhanced by the amygdala. Her threshold for noticing another person's pain has been described by researchers as unusually high. What this points to, when you add it all up, is that the amygdala doesn't just detect threats. It shapes how you encode and remember experiences that matter. Which ones get flagged as significant? Which ones you carry forward? Without that system, the past is flatter. Certain lessons don't stick the way they should. There's also what the research suggests about a subtler cost, one you might not immediately think of. The amygdala appears to play a central role in fear generalization. The ability to recognize that something similar to a past threat is also worth being cautious about. You don't need to have been bitten by every dog to learn to be alert around an unfamiliar one that's growling. That generalization, that spreading of learned caution, is something SM's brain does poorly, and it helps explain the disproportionate number of dangerous situations she's reportedly found herself in over the course of her life. Researchers have described this pattern as one where the absence of the amygdala doesn't just remove fear responses. It removes the ability to make nuanced, anticipatory safety assessments, the quiet background processing that keeps most people out of situations they'd otherwise walk into. This reframes what the amygdala actually is. Not just an alarm bell, but something closer to a prediction engine, one that runs constantly, quietly, mostly beneath your awareness, updating its model of what's safe and what isn't. And it raises a question that researchers are still working through. What happens when the predictions are systematically wrong? When the engine is miscalibrated, firing at things that aren't dangerous, missing things that are? That's not fearlessness. That's anxiety. And in a real sense, SM's case and anxiety disorders represent opposite ends of the same broken spectrum. SM eventually became one of the most studied individuals in the history of neuroscience. Documented in peer-reviewed literature, since the early 1990s, voluntarily participating in study after study. And she's done so, by all accounts in the research, with a consistent openness, curious about her own condition in a way that the scientists who worked with her have noted is almost unusual, which, given what we now know about how the amygdala shapes emotional memory and threat anticipation, makes a certain kind of sense. She couldn't be afraid of knowing. She couldn't dread the results. The signal that might have made someone else hesitate simply wasn't there. There's something clarifying about that. Fear is not a weakness. It's not a failure of will. It's a biological system built over hundreds of millions of years to solve a specific and genuinely hard problem. How do you stay alive in an uncertain world? The answer evolution landed on was, learn what has harmed you before, anticipate what might harm you next, and keep that knowledge ready at all times, encoded in a structure smaller than your thumb, buried at the center of your skull, firing before you've even had a conscious thought. SM's brain cannot do that, and without it, she has lived a life that is, in measurable ways, more exposed to harm, not because she chose danger, but because the mechanism that would have quietly steered her away from it was never working. The goal, then, isn't to eliminate fear. It's to understand what your fear is actually telling you, because most of the time, it's not random noise. Most of the time, it's the oldest, most battle-tested part of your brain trying, in the only language it has, to keep you safe. And once you understand that, once you stop treating fear as the enemy, you can start asking the more useful question. Is this signal accurate? Is this prediction right? That question is where therapy starts, where real courage lives, and where, if SM's case has taught us anything, the process of healing can begin.